Good morning. Welcome to Victorious Faith. I'm Cherri Campbell. We are studying healing in our redemption. And that means that we are redeemed from sickness and disease and pain because it's included in the price that Jesus paid for us in his sufferings when he shed blood for us starting from the Garden of Gethsemane, and then his beatings, and then the cross, and then his death. And we're going to get to that specific study as we go further. But I'm showing you from scriptures that healing for sickness and disease is included in the price that Jesus paid for you. In other words, your healing is already paid for. Your sickness and disease was already carried and borne by Jesus when he suffered, just like your sin was borne by Jesus. And therefore you should resist it. Resist it. Cast it off of you. Don't receive it. Resist it knowing that it's already paid for, and therefore you don't have to suffer. Now let's go back to Isaiah 53. And I've been going over these verses slowly for the last 3 days. And I showed you that in the King James Bible and some other translations that are very close to the King James, that there are words that are used in the King James that are not translated correctly, and they give the wrong idea, the wrong meaning of the words. And the last 3 days, we looked at the word grief and griefs. And we saw that it's the Hebrew word choli, meaning sickness, disease, illness, violent illness, and persistent illness, suffering and torment and affliction. And today, I want to show you another word. Actually, yesterday, to remind you, I showed you other scriptures in the King James Bible, other parts of the Bible, where the King James translated the Hebrew word choli as sickness or disease. I shared this with you at the end of yesterday's program. In Deuteronomy 7:15 in the King James, the Lord will take away from thee all sickness. Sickness is the Hebrew word choli. So you see that the King James translates that word choli as sickness in Deuteronomy 7:15. Also Deuteronomy 28:61. 28:61, also every sickness and every plague. And that word sickness is the Hebrew word choli. And notice King James translates choli as sickness. And then 1 Kings 17:17, it talks about the son of the mistress of the house fell sick, and his sickness was so sore there was no breath left in him. The word, he fell sick and his sickness. That word sickness is the Hebrew word choli. So notice the King James also translates the word choli as sickness in this verse, 1 Kings 17:17. And then also one more I gave you, 2 Chronicles 16:12. 2 Chronicles 16:12. King Asa was diseased in his feet until his disease was exceeding great, yet in his disease he sought not the Lord. Well, that says his disease was exceeding great. It's the Hebrew word choli, translated disease. And in his disease he sought not the Lord. Disease again is the Hebrew word choli. So notice again, the King James translators translated the Hebrew word choli as disease in this verse. So why then did they translate that Hebrew word choli in Isaiah 53? verses 3 and 4 as grief. Why? Don't know. Except that it is possible it just didn't quite fit their own doctrine for healing. But whatever was the reason, we don't know why. But grief is not a good translation because in modern English, grief is emotional. But the Hebrew word is very literally physical sickness, disease, and illness. Now, let me show you another word. Also in Isaiah 53, 3 and 4. Another word in Isaiah 53, verses 3 and 4, is the word sorrows. Sorrows. But there again, just like grief, sorrow is very close to grief in modern English. Sorrow and grief. But sorrow is also emotional. Sorrow is emotional. And yet, again, this word in the Hebrew should be literally translated pain. Pain. The Hebrew word found in Isaiah 53, 3 and 4 that is translated sorrows is the Hebrew word makob, M-A-K-O-B. M-A-K-O-B, makob. And it literally means to be in pain, to have pain, to cause pain. To be in pain, have pain, cause pain. And so literally it should be translated pains. Now that can be, it says in the definition, it could be emotional pain or physical pain. It could be physical pain or emotional pain. But the word sorrow is strictly emotional. And you don't ever relate sorrow to physical. And so that's why, again, sorrow is a very bad translation for this word. The literal definition is pain. To be in pain, have pain, or cause pain. And so as a noun, it's to be in pain or have pain. Of course, to cause pain would be the verb. So he's a man of sorrows, literally translated, correctly translated, he's a man of pains. Pains. And yes, pain can be physical or emotional. But it includes the physical. And again, I told you yesterday that the Young's literal translation, Young, he wrote the Young's Concordance, and he translated the Bible in a very literal translation, meaning that he even wrote those sentences and the words in the same order as the Hebrew or the Greek, rather than in the English sentence structure where we would put an adjective before a noun. The red car. You know, like in Spanish, you'd say the car red. Well, it's the same. The sentence structures are different in the Hebrew and the Greek, but Young translated it word for word, literally, even using the same sentence structure. And so he translates that word in verse 3, he is despised and left of men, a man of pains. Now that's where King James says a man of sorrows. He says a man of pains, and then the King James says acquainted with grief, but Young translates it acquainted with sickness. And we said the literal translation is sickness, disease, and illness. So Young says a man of pains acquainted with sickness. So literally, you have to see that these words are not referring to emotional grief and sorrow, but a man of pain, pain being both physical and emotional, and acquainted with sickness, disease, illness being strictly physical. And so, again, I can show you where in the King James Bible, that word makob was translated pain in other verses in the Bible. Job 14:22, his flesh upon him shall have pain. That's the Hebrew word makob. So the King James did translate it pain. His flesh shall have pain. And then also, for example, Jeremiah 51, verse 8, Babylon is suddenly fallen and destroyed. Take balm for her pain, so she may be healed. Balm for her pain. Pain is makob in the Hebrew. Makob, then, even in the King James, was translated as pain in these verses. But for some reason in Isaiah 53, the translators use the word sorrow. So I want you to see that these words, grief and sorrows, are not good. You should translate them as grief is sickness, disease, illness, violent illness, and persistent illness. And pain and sorrows should be translated as pains, plural. It is plural in the Hebrew. Pains, both physical and mental and emotional. Now, let me show you another Hebrew word. And now this is where it was actually translated correctly, but I want you to see the significance of these words in Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53, verse 4. Again, let's look at the word that in the King James, surely he hath borne our griefs, which we said griefs is sicknesses, diseases, and illness. But let's look at the word borne. Borne. Surely he has borne. Well, what does the word borne mean? That's B-O-R-N-E. Born. And that's to actually the past tense for the word bear, B-A-R-E. In verse 12, Isaiah 53:12, it says, he bare the sin of many. He bare, B-A-R-E, the sin. He bare the sin. And in verse 4, he hath borne our sicknesses and diseases. Now that word born or bear, past tense, is very, very important. It is the Hebrew word N-A-S-A. N-A-S-A. Now I just love that because if you were to pronounce it, it would be NASA. Well, in the United States, we have the word NASA. It's actually an acronym, NASA, but that refers to our space program, and the development of space exploration and rockets and shuttles and satellites and all that. Well, if you think of a rocket, a space shuttle, I should say, a space shuttle taking off, and it goes up, and it goes far, 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 far away. Now that's interesting that even though in the United States, NASA is an acronym, which means it stands for National Aeronautics and Space Administration. National Aeronautics and Space Administration. It is an independent agency of the United States federal government. National Aeronautics Space Administration. So it's an acronym, NASA. But to me, it's so exciting that we use that acronym because in the Hebrew language, in the Bible, the word NASA, not an acronym, just a word, NASA, it means literally to lift up, to bear, B-E-A-R, away, to remove, to a distance, to lift up, to bear away, to remove, to a distance, to lift up, to bear away, to remove, to a distance. Well, that gives me always in my mind a picture of a space shuttle lifting up, bearing away to a far, far distance out in space. But it's the Hebrew word NASA. And this is specifically the word used in relation to the scapegoat. Now let's talk about the scapegoat. For that, we have to go back to the book of Leviticus. It's in the law of Moses. It had to do with the Day of Atonement. And when the high priest would sacrifice sin offerings for the sins of the people for the whole year, it would be one day a year to pay for the sins for the people. However, it couldn't permanently pay for their sin because it had to be repeated every year. He had to sacrifice this sacrifice for their sins every single year. Now, let me take you to Leviticus chapter 16, and I'm going to read to you what it says about the Day of Atonement and about how the high priest is supposed to sacrifice the goat and then present a second goat as a scapegoat. Leviticus chapter 16, starting in verse 6. Aaron, well, let me start in verse 3. This is how Aaron is to enter the sanctuary area: with a young bull for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering. And then he puts on the sacred linen tunic and linen undergarments. So he's supposed to put on the high priestly garments. And then verse 5, from the Israelite community, he is to take 2 male goats for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering. Verse 6, Aaron is to offer the bull for his own sin offering, to make atonement for himself and his household. Verse 7, then he is to take the 2 goats and present them before the Lord at the entrance to the tent of meeting. He is to cast lots for the 2 goats, 1 lot for the Lord. That means it will be killed as a sacrifice. And the other lot for the scapegoat. So however they cast lots, that would be like drawing sticks or something like that. And whichever lot fell to one, it was for the Lord, it would be killed as a sacrifice. Then the other lot fell to the other goat to become the scapegoat. Now that word scapegoat actually means the goat of removal. The goat of removal. And then verse 9. Aaron shall bring the goat whose lot falls to the Lord, that's to be a sacrifice, and sacrifice it for a sin offering. Verse 10. But the goat chosen by Lot as the scapegoat, now that word scapegoat means the goat of removal, shall be presented alive before the Lord, to be used for making atonement by sending it into the desert or the wilderness as a scapegoat, by sending it into the desert or the wilderness as a scapegoat. And then go down to verse 20. Verse 20, Leviticus 16:20. When Aaron has finished making atonement for the most holy place, that means he killed the first goat that was for the Lord, made it a sacrifice, and then verses 11 through 19 talk about how he is to take the blood of the sacrificed goat and sprinkle it on the altar and make atonement for the people. So he sprinkles the blood of the killed goat. Now, verse 20, after he finished killing one goat as a sacrifice and sprinkling its blood on the altar, then, verse 20, when Aaron has finished making atonement for the most holy place, the tent of meeting, and the altar, he shall bring forward the live goat. Verse 21. He is to lay both hands on the head of the live goat, on the head of the live goat, and confess over it, speak over it, all the wickedness and rebellion of the Israelites, all their sins, and put them on the goat's head. Put them on the goat's head. So he speaks, he lays both hands on the head of the live goat, and he confesses and speaks over the goat all the sins, wickedness, and rebellion of the Israelites. And then he shall send the goat away. And I'll add, alive, into the desert, in the care of a man appointed for the task. Verse 22, the goat will carry on itself all their sins to a solitary or a remote place, and the man shall release it in the desert. Now, the King James says in verse 22, where it says the goat will carry on itself, the King James says the goat shall bear upon him all their iniquities, all their sins, to a land not inhabited, and he, the man, shall let go the goat in the wilderness. Now that word bear upon him all their iniquities, all their sins, that word bear is the Hebrew word nasa, N-A-S-A. And that word, by definition, means to lift up, to bear away, to remove to a distance. To lift up, to bear away, to remove to a distance. Now, why were there two goats? Because these two goats are a picture, type and shadow, prophetically hundreds and thousands of years actually before Christ, that represent both the death of Christ and the resurrection of Christ. And of course, since you cannot resurrect an animal, they had to have two animals, a dead one and a live one, in order to represent the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So this goat is to be a picture of Jesus Christ. But two goats, one represents the death of Christ, one represents the resurrection of Christ, because you can't resurrect a goat. So they had two goats for the death and resurrection of Christ. But the word bear away means literally that this goat was to carry on itself all their sins to a far remote, solitary place. Now, if we quickly go back to Isaiah 53 and verse 4, surely he has borne Nasa, our griefs, or Koli, sicknesses and diseases. Notice he has carried away, removed our sicknesses and diseases. In the same way, in verse 12, he bare the sins of many. He carried away our sins. He also carried away your sickness and your disease. Well, I'm out of time, so join me next week. And remember, God loves you. You're blessed and highly favored by the Lord.